My boss fired me after 18 years flying their planes. Then flights started getting cancelled. James Carter had spent nearly 2 decades suspended between clouds and blue skies, faithfully guiding aircraft across the American Southeast. At 56 years old, he wore the years of service like a second skin, creased at the corners of his eyes, seasoned in his calm voice, and deeply embedded in the way he gripped the yoke of a CRJ-700 like an old friend. Living in Charlotte, North Carolina, with his wife Linda and 2 grown children who had since flown thenist, James had built a quiet, orderly life where routine brought comfort and the hum of engines felt more like a heartbeat than a noise. He wasn't the kind to draw attention. If anything, his presence was often compared to their reliable ticking of a clock. Always there, always precise. Passengers might not have remembered his name, but fellow crew members spoke of him with quiet respect. In moments of turbulence, both literal and operational, James was the voice that steadied nerves and brought birds safely home. But even seasoned pilots can feel the shift in wind before the storm arrives. SkyAir, the regional airline he had given his life to, was undergoing a transformation. It wasn't announced loudly. No press releases or sweeping memos, but James noticed the subtle tremors, new faces in suits walking briskly through hangars, closed-door meetings he no longer attended, and a silence in email threads where his name used to appear. The old base manager, who once greeted James with a nod and a handshake every morning, now avoided eye contact. James wasn't a man prone to paranoia, but he had flown through enough storms to recognize when something dangerous was brewing just beyond the horizon. And this felt like the build-up before a nosedive. It started with little things, briefings where his suggestions were brushed aside, flight assignments that seemed to dry up without reason, rumors circulating in break rooms about restructuring and efficiency. Younger pilots were being brought in, fresh out of training academies, bright-eyed and smiling. He didn't mind the enthusiasm, they reminded him of himself once, but the shift in tone was palpable. Experience was being replaced with cost-effectiveness. One evening, after returning from a late flight to Jacksonville, James sat alone in the crew lounge, sipping lukewarm coffee. The overhead lights buzzed. He stared out the window at the tarmac, where ground crews moved like shadows in the sodium light. Something had changed in the soul of SkyAir. It no longer felt like the company he had dedicated 18 years to. It felt colder, calculated, like someone somewhere was tightening screws not on planes but on people. At home, Linda noticed the difference. He spoke less about work. The light in his eyes dimmed slightly each night, but he shrugged it off. Just tired, he'd say. Long flights. But it wasn't the altitude that was draining him. It was the creeping sense that his value was being silently erased, that everything he had built was now expendable in the eyes of those who saw only profit margins. He kept flying, kept arriving on time, kept performing the walkarounds with meticulous attention. But the smiles from management faded. Pilots he had mentored now acted like they barely knew him. Something was coming, and though he didn't yet know what it was, James Carter, calm, capable, unshakable, could feel it in his bones. The morning air in Charlotte was unusually crisp for early spring. James Carter, dressed in his neatly pressed uniform, arrived at SkyAir headquarters just before 7 o'clock, as he had done for nearly 2 decades. The badge at the front desk beeped with its familiar sound, but the security guard, usually quick with a nod, barely glanced up. James walked through the halls, like a ghost revisiting the house he once lived in, every corner familiar yet increasingly foreign. The walls bore posters with slogans about innovation and future-forward thinking, but none of them mentioned loyalty, experience, or integrity, words James had lived by. He was scheduled for a short hop to Charleston that morning. As he headed toward the crew room to review the flight plan, his company-issued phone vibrated. It was a calendar notification, a new appointment scheduled without warning. Meeting with HR, 7:15 a.m., room 304. James frowned. He hadn't requested any meeting, nor had anyone informed him about it beforehand. He turned on his heel and walked down the hall with a growing sense of unease pressing against his chest. Room 304 was quiet. The lights inside were on, and through the narrow window he could see 2 people seated at a small table. Miriam from Human Resources, and someone James didn't recognize, a man in a grey suit tapping on a sleek laptop with the Sky Air logo. When he entered, both stood awkwardly. No one smiled. The air felt thinner. "Captain Carter," Miriam said, motioning toward the chair across from her, "coming in." "Thank you." For James sat, his cap resting on his knee, eyes shifting between the two faces before him. Miriam cleared her throat. "We wanted to speak with you directly this morning. As part of the company's ongoing restructuring process, we've made the difficult decision to eliminate certain positions. Unfortunately, this affects your role as captain." "I'm being let go?" James finally asked, his voice even, almost detached. "We're offering a severance package," Miriam continued quickly, pushing a folder toward him. "You'll find the details inside, including options regarding your benefits and pension. You're not being dismissed for cause. This is a corporate decision, not a reflection of your performance." The folder sat on the table like a tombstone. James didn't reach for it. "I've flown every major route in this network," he said quietly. "I've never been late. Never. Failed a check ride. Never taken a sick day without warning. 18 years. Miriam gave a strained nod. "We appreciate your dedication truly. This was not an easy—" "You didn't even call me last night to warn me," James cut in, his tone still calm but now edged with steel. "You let me wake up thinking I had a job." "I understand this is difficult," she said. But she didn't. Neither of them did. James stood. The room didn't spin, but the ground beneath him didn't feel stable either. He took the folder without looking at it and left the room without another word. In the hallway, people passed him without a glance. The same pilots he had trained, greeted, flown with. None looked his way. Back in the locker room, he removed his uniform jacket and folded it slowly, like a ritual, careful not to wrinkle the insignia on the shoulder. He placed it under his arm, walked past the coffee machine for the last time, and stepped outside into the sunlight. It wasn't until he reached the parking lot that he saw the final insult. Standing near the curb was a young man, tall, thin, with a barely there mustache, and shoes that looked too new for a tarmac. He was shaking hands with a Sky Air executive. James recognized the standard-issue Sky Air pilot wings pinned to the newcomer's chest. The young man's uniform was tailored, clean, untouched by years of wear. He was beaming, proud. As James passed, their eyes met. The young pilot offered a nod and a smile. James didn't return it. He drove home in silence. The Charlotte skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror, and the quiet inside the car grew louder. At home, Linda was still in her robe, reading on the porch. She stood the moment she saw his face. "What happened?" she asked. "I don't work there anymore," he said simply, stepping past her into the house. The next few hours unfolded in slow motion. The folder sat unopened on the kitchen table. The phone remained silent. No messages, no apologies. Linda offered comfort, but there were no words to soften the blow. Their lives had revolved around his schedule for nearly 20 years. Vacations timed around his off days, dinners delayed until he returned from evening landings, birthdays and anniversaries celebrated in hotel rooms or airport restaurants. It wasn't just a job, it was who he was. That night, sleep did not come easily. James lay awake, replaying every flight, every emergency he'd calmly handled, every student pilot he had mentored. None of it had mattered, not in the eyes of the new regime. He was just another number, another expense trimmed in a spreadsheet. And yet something deeper than anger stirred inside him. It wasn't resentment, it wasn't even humiliation. It was confusion. Something about the timing, the coldness, the way they replaced him without hesitation. It all felt too sudden, too planned. He hadn't even made a mistake, hadn't even received a warning. As the hours passed, James knew only one thing for certain. This wasn't just about cost-cutting. Something else was going on, and he intended to find out what it was. The days following James Carter's departure from Sky Air unfolded like a quiet, unwelcome retreat from a life once structured by checklists and flight plans. For the first time in 18 years, there were no early morning alarms, no uniform to press, no cockpit waiting for him before sunrise. His body still woke before 6 o'clock each morning, conditioned by routine, but now it was met with silence and stillness. The hum of engines was replaced by the tick of a kitchen clock and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. His world had gone still, but the sky moved on without him. At first, James tried to adjust, throwing himself into home repairs, long walks, and the occasional lunch with old friends. But the quiet felt foreign. There was no flight log to complete, no descent checklist to run through. The absence of duty gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Lind encouraged him to enjoy the pause, to take it as a well-earned rest. But rest, to James, had always come between flights, not after them. He kept in touch with a few former colleagues, flight attendants, mechanics, dispatchers. The conversations were polite at first, surface level. Then, slowly, the undercurrent of tension began to emerge. Messages came through late at night or early in the morning. Another cancellation today, mechanical. Systems glitch delayed the Atlanta route 3 hours. Dispatch gave the wrong crew the wrong aircraft again. James read each one carefully, noting the details, the aircraft model, the route, the nature of the issue. Within 2 weeks, the pattern was unmistakable. Cancellations and delays were spiking, especially on the same fleet he had worked on, the CRJ 700s and 900s. Flights that had operated with the precision of a Swiss watch were now being grounded last minute due to maintenance, concerns, or crew reassignments. Passengers voiced their anger online. News segments highlighted rising frustration at regional hubs like Charlotte, Richmond, and Jacksonville. Sky Air, once known for its reliable mid-range routes, was now synonymous with delay. James sat on his back porch one evening, laptop open, watching a local news broadcast showing footage of a crowded terminal where flight after flight had been marked cancelled. He leaned forward when the camera panned over a passenger, angrily waving a boarding pass. "This airline used to be on time," the man shouted. "Schedule a plane." Now it's like they don't even know how to. Behind the man, James recognized the gate number. It was a route he had flown dozens of times. Nothing about that leg had ever caused trouble. He closed the laptop and stared out at the horizon, where the sky darkened into twilight. The same sky he had flown through thousands of times, the same sky now being denied to so many. The next morning, he opened the laptop again. Not for the news, this time, but for data. He started to cross-reference the cancellation reports available online with the aircraft types and flight paths. There was a startling correlation. Every flight affected belonged to the same subset of aircraft, the same models James had flagged in an internal memo nearly a year before. That memo, he now recalled with clarity, had been brushed aside by his supervisors. He had expressed concern about a wear issue in the nose gear assembly that could, over time, cause hydraulic inconsistencies. He had even recommended grounding a handful of planes for deeper inspection. They had told him the issue was being monitored. Now those same aircraft were being grounded anyway, but only after causing disruptions. James ran his hand across his face and leaned back in the chair. A part of him had hoped his departure was just a byproduct of corporate downsizing, but watching the chaos unfold, he realized there was something darker at play. Someone had known about those mechanical concerns and done nothing. And when James pushed too hard, his silence had been bought with a severance package and a door closed behind him. Later that week, James met up with an old friend from the mechanics crew, Doug, a grizzled technician with grease-stained hands and a distrust of anything in a suit. They're scrambling. "Jimmy," Doug said over a cup of black coffee in a quiet diner, "these kids they brought in, half of them can't tell a trim tab from a flap actuator. Planes get flagged for inspection, and the new techs miss what's obvious to anyone who's done the job more than 6 months." James listened, his expression neutral, but inside pieces began to shift into place. "Corporate ain't letting us take planes offline unless it's absolutely necessary," Doug continued. "But these birds are tired. They're showing the exact wear patterns you warned about. That report you sent, I remember it, and now nobody can find it in the system." James felt the chill even in the warmth of the diner. His report had vanished. No trace, no record. He returned home with a sense of urgency growing inside him. Sitting at his desk, he retrieved the worn-out folder where he kept his personal copies of flight notes, memos, and correspondence. And there it was, his original technical memo printed and annotated in red ink. Proof. He placed it carefully aside. By the following weekend, Sky Air was making headlines in national outlets. The word pattern started to appear in reports. Passengers filed complaints with the Department of Transportation. Analysts speculated on operational mismanagement. Still, Sky Air remained vague in its public statements, blaming weather and staffing transitions. But James knew better. This wasn't weather, this wasn't chance. This was the quiet collapse of a system built on corner cutting and denial. And his removal from that system, sudden and unexplained, was now starting to look less like a layoff and more like a cover-up. He looked at the technical report once more, then back at his laptop. He was no longer simply an ex-pilot watching from the ground. Something had begun in the skies above, and now it was crashing into the public eye. James Carter wasn't done flying. Not yet. Not until he found out who grounded him and why. The message arrived late on a Thursday, tucked between promotional emails and a bank notification. James noticed it only because the subject line didn't match the others. It reads simply, "Coffee?" The sender was Amanda Hastings, a former flight attendant. He hadn't spoken to since the day he turned in his badge. They had flown together for years, often paired on long-haul routes, and shared a quiet camaraderie born from countless hours in the sky. The message was brief, almost cryptic. "Need to talk. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at Harper's Cafe." James stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed a short reply. "I'll be there." Harper's Cafe sat on a quiet corner near the edge of downtown Charlotte, its windows fogged slightly from the spring humidity. James arrived early, as was his habit, and took a seat near the back where the lighting was soft and the noise from the street muffled. He ordered a coffee, black, and waited. Amanda walked in 10 minutes later, her eyes scanning the room before they settled on him. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired from jet lag or a long shift, but the fatigue that sets in when something heavy won't leave your shoulders. She offered a faint smile and slid into the seat across from him. "Thanks for coming," she said. James nodded. "You said you needed to talk." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "Know that already. It's been a mess since you left. I've seen the headlines." "It's worse than what's in the papers," she said, voice dropping. "Schedules are getting changed without warning. Pilots are showing up to the wrong gates. Entire flight plans vanish from the system minutes before departure. It's like someone's tearing holes in the fabric, piece by piece." James listened without interrupting. Amanda wasn't prone to exaggeration. She was detail-oriented, organized to a fault. If she said something was off, it meant more than the usual turbulence. "I've seen flights reassigned 3-4 times in a single morning," she continued. "Pilots getting messages they were never meant to receive. One even got a maintenance report that was half redacted. And passengers are noticing. We've had people shouting at the gate, demanding answers we don't have." James leaned forward. "Are you saying it's deliberate?" Amanda hesitated. "I don't know, but it doesn't feel random. And the weirdest part is, no one at the top wants to talk about it. Every time someone brings it up, they get reassigned or suddenly stop asking questions." He studied her face. There was more. He could see it. "They're covering something," she said finally, "and I think you're connected to it." James didn't react. He had suspected as much. But hearing someone else say it gave his thoughts weight. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "I printed this from the internal schedule database. It shows which pilots were assigned to which aircraft the day before. Your replacement took over your old route. Look at the notes column." He unfolded the page. It was a crew schedule chart, dense with abbreviations and times. His eyes moved to the notes. Beside one flight was a red asterisk with a comment, "Route, override due to priority pilot assignment." "Per TD, James asked. Amanda nodded. "Thomas DeWitt, the new CEO. He's not supposed to get involved in individual route assignments. That's way below his pay grade. But his initials have started appearing in these override notes more frequently. He's handpicking certain routes, certain aircraft, and the pattern matches the same models you flagged before you were let go." James leaned back, the pieces beginning to form a darker picture. DeWitt had come in just before his dismissal. Now he was micromanaging aircraft assignments, and those same aircraft were the ones most frequently grounded. "You think he's trying to hide the maintenance issues?" James said. Amanda looked around, lowered her voice. "I think he knew about them before he even took over. And I think he's trying to shuffle things around just enough to keep the problems out of view." "But why fire me?" "Because you documented it. You made it real." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the cafe around them. James folded the paper and slid it into his jacket. He could feel something rising in him, an old instinct, the one that kicked in mid-flight when warning lights flashed and alarms buzzed. The instinct to stay calm, to assess, to act. "I need access," he said at last, "to logs, reports, whatever you can find." Amanda hesitated. "I could lose my job." "You could also stop something worse from happening." She nodded slowly, then reached for her bag again. "I've been saving things, print-out screenshots, stuff they deleted from the system. I'll get you copies." As they parted outside the cafe, Amanda placed a hand on his arm. "Be careful. If they went through this much trouble to get rid of you quietly, they won't appreciate you digging around." James nodded. He understood the risk. But walking back to his car, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Not anger, not regret. Purpose. Whatever Sky Air was hiding, it had already begun to unravel. And if someone had to pull the next thread, it might as well be the man they tried to ground without cause. The morning light filtered through the blinds in James Carter's study, casting thin lines across the cluttered surface of his desk. The conversation with Amanda had stirred a dormant urgency within him, and now, with coffee cooling beside stacks of old flight manuals and personal folders, he began sifting through everything he had kept from his years at Sky Air. His system was old-fashioned, paper copies, labeled binders, handwritten annotations. What others had long since trusted to cloud storage, James had kept close in drawers and cabinets, printed and preserved. He started with maintenance logs from the last 2 years, copies of pre-flight checklists where he had jotted down notes and emails printed out from department heads. Most of it was procedural standard communications about weather updates, staff changes and training modules. But in the third binder, under a tab labeled Safety Protocols, he found it. It was a technical report, 7 pages long, dated 9 months before his dismissal. The cover sheet bore his name and the subject line, Hydraulic Integrity Concerns, CRJ Fleet Analysis. He remembered writing it late one night after a mechanical irregularity during final descent had nearly compromised braking systems. The incident hadn't resulted in a reportable emergency, but it had been enough for James to begin digging. His findings had been specific. He had identified wear patterns in the nose gear hydraulic components, particularly in aircraft that had exceeded a certain number of cycles. The data, compiled from internal maintenance schedules, pointed to a clear risk. He had urged immediate review and potential grounding of 6 aircraft for further inspection. The final paragraph of the report stood out now more than ever. Neglecting this issue, even temporarily, may lead to operational disruptions. If unresolved, the probability of mechanical delays or cancellations will increase, particularly on aircraft with recurrent routing assignments on short-haul cycles. He had sent the report to 3 individuals: his base supervisor, the head of fleet maintenance, and 1 copy to himself. He remembered following up twice by email. No one had replied in writing. He had been told verbally that the matter was not a current priority. Now the weight of that dismissal settled into a new shape. They hadn't just ignored the warning, they had erased it, or tried to. But James still had the original, his copy, untouched, annotated, signed. He placed it carefully in a new folder and set it aside. The timing of the recent cancellations aligned almost exactly with the fleet segment he had mentioned. The newer pilots, rushed into position, likely didn't even know the aircraft histories. The pressure from corporate to maintain high flight volume meant little room for proper downtime or inspections. Everything was being pushed harder, longer, faster, and cracks were beginning to show. By mid-afternoon, James turned his attention to his old email archives. He had saved entire inboxes onto external drives before his termination. One by one, he opened files, searching for correspondence that might corroborate what Amanda had hinted at: the involvement of Thomas DeWitt and upper management in suppressing or ignoring safety concerns. Buried in a thread marked Confidential Ops Review, he found something unusual. A message from the former head of operations, dated just weeks before DeWitt's takeover, discussing fleet assessment prioritization and the phrase strategic tolerance for deferred maintenance. The wording was vague, corporate, but James knew how to read between the lines. Strategic tolerance was often code for calculated risk. Deferred maintenance meant pushing repairs off as long as legally permissible. In a margin-driven environment, such choices were not uncommon, but when they intersected with real safety concerns, they became a gamble. He printed the email and added it to the folder. That night, he and Linda sat quietly at the dinner table. He hadn't shared everything with her yet, but she could sense the weight of whatever had returned to occupy his thoughts. She didn't press him. Instead, after the dishes were cleared and the kitchen lights dimmed, she handed him a key. "It's for the old file cabinet in the garage," she said. "Told me not to let you near it unless it was important. You locked it up last year after the audit." He stared at her, surprised, then took the key without a word. The file cabinet was wedged in the far corner behind camping gear and an old vacuum. Inside were boxes of documents from his annual performance reviews, aircraft incident logs, and maintenance briefing notes. In the back, taped to the inside of the drawer, was a flash drive in a sealed envelope labeled CRJ 7237, Jacksonville Incident. His breath caught. CRJ 7237 had been the plane involved in the braking anomaly that sparked his initial report. The flight had landed safely, no damage, no injuries, but James had spent days afterward reviewing data from the cockpit voice recorder and the aircraft's onboard diagnostics. The flash drive contained that data. Back inside, he plugged it into his laptop. Charts and logs appeared on the screen, each time stamped, detailing minute-by-minute telemetry from the flight. The data confirmed hydraulic pressure irregularities, pressure dips at key moments during approach and landing, precisely the kind that could lead to brake failure under worse conditions. He had documented it thoroughly and filed the analysis, but now, with context, it painted an even more damning picture. These weren't random malfunctions, they were systemic, known, ignored. By the time midnight passed, James had built a small but growing archive of proof. His report, the ignored warnings, the suppressed emails, and now flight data to support his claims. What had seemed like a clean break, a standard downsizing, was unraveling into something far more calculated. Someone had made a choice to keep those planes flying. Someone had silenced the voices, raising alarms. And now, passengers were paying the price in delays and disrupted travel. James wasn't interested in revenge, but truth, that was different. He had spent his life ensuring the safety of every person who boarded a flight under his command. Now, even grounded, he could still fulfill that duty. He stared at the open folder on his desk, then reached for a clean sheet of paper. At the top, he wrote one word in bold: sequence. If he was going to act, he needed order, method, purpose. He would not rush into confrontation. He would gather, prepare, document, and when the time came, there would be no denying what had been done. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, James Carter prepared for a flight of a different kind, the kind where landing safely meant pulling others out of the sky before it was too late. The name Thomas DeWitt had echoed quietly in the corners of James Carter's mind ever since Amanda first mentioned it at Harper's Cafe. It wasn't a name James had associated with pilots or crew. DeWitt had never been part of the operational side of Sky Air. He hadn't worked up through the ranks or sat through endless hours of simulation or pre-flight briefings. Instead, he'd arrived at the company like a weather front, swift, disruptive, and ushered in by a board eager to see profit margins expand. James remembered the internal email announcing DeWitt's appointment, just weeks before the strange shifts began. The message had been full of corporate enthusiasm, touting strategic leadership experience and visionary cost management. To most of the staff, it had simply meant someone else in a suit, someone who would remain distant from the tarmac and cockpit, but still dictate how they operated. At the time, James had skimmed over it without much interest. Now, with documents piling on his desk and Amanda's schedule notes freshly reviewed, the man's arrival felt like the opening move in a quiet dismantling. Digging through his old notes and saved briefings, James began assembling a profile, not of the man but of his impact. The changes didn't start with press releases. They started in silence. Maintenance approvals took longer, supply requests were returned for review, and experienced crew members began quietly disappearing. It wasn't a mass firing, it was surgical. Pilots with tenure were reassigned to reserve status. Senior mechanics were offered early retirement. The company had shifted not with force but with intention. One layer of institutional memory at a time, the foundation was being erased. James made a list on a yellow legal pad, drawing a line between the timeline of DeWitt's arrival and the first signs of system irregularities. Every mark he made felt heavier. The dismissal of the old fleet manager, the abrupt retirement of the head of safety compliance, the overhaul of the scheduling department, each step methodical, not reactive, planned. He reviewed a copy of a company bulletin sent 2 weeks after DeWitt's appointment. In it, new language was introduced regarding fleet optimization and efficiency realignment. At the time, the phrases had passed unnoticed, buried in jargon. Now viewed through the lens of Amanda's reports and James's forgotten memo, they read like coded instructions. Move aircraft more frequently, shorten maintenance cycles, automate, crew assignments to reduce human oversight. James placed the memo next to the maintenance report from the Jacksonville incident. Together, they formed a story. A warning had been issued. A shift in leadership had followed. That warning had then been ignored, and soon after, the voice that raised it had been silenced. There was no proof, not yet, that DeWitt himself had read the report. But the strategic decisions made in the months. Following a line too closely for coincidence, he had come in not just to shape Sky Air's structure, but to squeeze profitability from every available corner, regardless of consequence. And in doing so, he had created an environment where risk was not just tolerated, it was embedded. Amanda had mentioned seeing DeWitt's initials beside flight overrides. James found that detail chilling. A CEO dictating specific flight crew changes was unheard of. It suggested more than control, it suggested awareness. Awareness of which aircraft were involved, which routes were affected, and more crucially, who was asking questions. James returned to the printout Amanda had given him. The override note for the CRJ 7237 stood out. It had been marked for priority, reassignment. 2 days after his technical memo had circulated, he checked the timeline again. That particular flight had experienced 2 delays in the following week due to unplanned maintenance holds, and yet the aircraft had continued flying until a last-minute cancellation left passengers stranded in Atlanta. That cancellation had made the news. DeWitt had given an interview the next day, brushing it off as a minor systems issue promptly resolved. James had watched that interview at the time, not knowing the full story. Now, every word struck a different chord. Not only had the CEO known of the risks, but he had chosen to minimize them publicly. He hadn't acted to protect the integrity of the fleet or the safety of the passengers. He'd acted to protect the company's reputation and his own. In the following days, James resumed his meetings with Amanda, always in low-profile places, never twice in the same location. She began bringing more documents, training logs, flight briefings, emails between mid-level managers, expressing concern that their recommendations were being overturned from above. One message caught James's eye. It was from a dispatcher, flagged urgent, referencing a flight that had been cleared for takeoff despite a flagged hydraulic discrepancy. The response from management had been cold and simple, deemed acceptable under current tolerance guidelines. There it was again, tolerance. A word meant to bridge the space between caution and recklessness. By the time James compiled the documents into his growing dossier, the shape of the narrative had become disturbingly clear. DeWitt had initiated a campaign of artificial efficiency, one that rewarded silence and punished diligence. Those who questioned the system were quietly removed. Those who complied were promoted. It wasn't sabotage. It was systemic negligence, built into the very architecture of operations. James stared at the stack of papers on his desk. He no longer felt like an outsider watching a failing company from afar. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a widening Chasm, watching others being pulled toward it, knowing he had once stood at the very center and been pushed out before he could stop the collapse. He folded his technical report and placed it in a new binder alongside the email threads and Amanda's printouts. His pilot's logbook, once filled with routes, altitudes, and fuel logs, now sat beside a new kind of flight plan, one that would not take place in the air, but through boardrooms, legal offices, and the public eye. Thomas DeWitt had made a choice. So had Sky Air, and now so would James Carter. James Carter no longer moved like a man drifting through forced retirement. Each morning began with purpose, early, silent, methodical. He rose before sunrise, reviewed notes, organized files, and charted the movements of the very company that had tried to leave him behind. His study, once a quiet room for reading and reflection, had transformed into a command center. On one wall, printouts and maps were pinned with thumbtacks and string, tracing connections between aircraft, routes, personnel, and incidents. On his desk, binders sat stacked in careful order, each labeled with a part of the growing puzzle. Every piece had a purpose, every detail mattered. He knew that to confront Sky Air he couldn't rely on hunches or memory. He needed hard, irrefutable facts, evidence that not only confirmed the negligence, but tied it to deliberate decisions made at the highest levels. With Amanda's help, he already had documents and internal messages. But that alone wasn't enough. They needed more. Maintenance logs, incident reports, technical assessments, records that would show a clear pattern of suppression and manipulation. James reached out to an old contact, someone who had retired 2 years earlier, but still had deep ties within the maintenance division. His name was Frank Milton, a veteran mechanic known for being blunt, careful, and immune to corporate charm. James and Frank had worked together countless times, especially during overnight inspections and urgent turnarounds. There had always been a mutual respect. James for Frank's thoroughness, Frank for James's refusal to cut corners. They met at a quiet restaurant just outside the city, one frequented by airline staff but distant enough to avoid attention. Frank arrived with a wary look, but once seated and assured that nothing they said would leave the table, he relaxed. "You're not wrong to dig," Frank said, after James laid out the basics. "I've heard things, seen things too. Some of those birds you flagged, they should have been grounded 6 months ago. But you know how it works now, cost first, safety second." James pushed a folder toward him. "Do you still have access to the service logs? I need entries for a specific group of aircraft, CRJ models with over 5,000 cycles, particularly those assigned to the Southeast Corridor." Frank exhaled. Slowly, "You realize that stuff isn't meant to be pulled without authorization. I'm not asking you to copy anything, just look, confirm what we already suspect." Frank didn't answer right away. He drummed his fingers on the table, staring at the menu without reading it. "I might know someone still inside who owes me," he said finally. "But if I do this, you have to promise me. Whatever you're planning, you do it clean. No leaking. To news blogs. No grandstanding." James nodded, destroying it from within. "I'm not trying to destroy the company. I'm trying to stop what's already." 3 days later, Frank returned with a small package, 6 printed pages, each a maintenance log summary. They were not marked confidential, but James knew they weren't the kind of documents Sky Air wanted in the hands of former employees. They showed consistent deferrals, duplicate entries marked as reviewed without action, and at least 2 aircraft that had been cleared for flight with components marked near limit. James read through them carefully, his pen moving steadily. As he underlined specific lines, it wasn't just neglect, it was intent. Someone had altered entries. Service notes had been overwritten. Entire inspection steps were marked completed under technician IDs that hadn't been on shift that day. It was forgery, or close enough to be indistinguishable. Amanda joined him that evening. They spread the documents across the dining table, going line by line. Her eyes widened as she recognized names and shifts. "This one," she said, tapping a report, "being tired of fighting shadows. That technician quit last month," said something about James, nodded. He took out the crew schedules she had shared earlier. Matching them against the logs, they found 3 flights where mechanical notes had been altered just before takeoff. each involving planes James had once flown, each now part of Sky Air's most disrupted routes. Their next step was riskier. James contacted a legal advisor, someone who had represented pilots in safety cases before. He didn't reveal names, not yet, but described the situation in broad terms. The attorney was cautious but intrigued. She confirmed that if James could prove systemic concealment of mechanical issues tied to executive decisions, the consequences could extend beyond financial penalties into criminal negligence. "You'll need corroboration," she said. Something. From inside, someone who's still active. Amanda was already ahead of him. She had begun reaching out quietly to current employees, crew schedulers, dispatchers, even a junior pilot who had recently expressed discomfort with the chaotic flight. Changes. Not all responded. Some were afraid. Others had signed strict non-disclosure agreements. But a few spoke anonymously, confirming what James already knew. The system was broken and someone at the top was pulling strings to keep it running despite the risks. One message, sent late at night from a temporary email address, hit James the E. "Hardest no, they just don't care. We're not pilots anymore, we're liabilities." He read the line again and again, hearing in it the voice of a company hollowed out by ambition and stripped of conscience. The evidence was building. James now had documentation of mechanical issues, manipulated logs, internal communications pointing to executive involvement, and the beginnings of employee testimony. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was enough to warrant attention from regulators, journalists, even prosecutors, if delivered properly, but James wasn't ready to move. Not yet. The next step had to be precise. Timing was critical. If they pushed too early, the company would close ranks, silence dissenters, and bury the truth under legal threats and denials. They needed a trigger, an undeniable event, something public, something indisputable. He would be the voice that broke through the silence. James Carter had been careful. Every meeting was quiet, every file encrypted, every phone call limited to trusted contacts. Still, caution had its limits. One morning, while reviewing his organized evidence in the study, he noticed something odd. One of the printed maintenance logs, previously marked with his handwritten notes, was missing from the folder. He was sure it had been there the night before. He checked the surrounding papers, the floor, the trash bin. Nothing. At first he thought it might have been misplaced. But James wasn't the kind of man who misplaced important documents. He had been too meticulous for too long. He tried to brush it off, told himself he must have moved it while sorting through other material. But the next day, a sharper warning arrived. His car, parked in the driveway overnight, locked as always, had been broken into. Nothing was taken. His wallet was in the house and the radio untouched. But the glove compartment had been rifled through, papers shuffled, and a small GPS tracker left behind under the seat. He found it by accident, a black plastic rectangle smaller than a matchbox, wedged near the seat rail. It was not something a common thief would carry nor leave behind by mistake. He brought it inside, placed it on the desk, and stared at it. The message was clear. Someone knew what he was doing. Someone was watching. That night, Linda came into the study after dinner and found James sitting in silence, the GPS tracker on the desk between his hands. She didn't speak at first, but her face tightened when she saw it. "We need to go to the police," she said. James shook his head. "Not yet. They'd open a report, ask questions, maybe notify the company. But they won't stop this. Not without context, not without proof." "You already have proof." "Not enough to protect the people still inside. Not enough to make it stick." She sat down beside him. "Have the protections you used to. You're not invincible, James. You're not flying anymore." "You don't." He knew she was right. He also knew he couldn't stop. The evidence wasn't just numbers and dates, it was a story. And stories had to be told in full or not at all. A day later, he received an anonymous email. No sender name. The subject read, "You're too close." The message was short. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop. Not everyone gets to walk away twice." Attached was a photo, taken through his own window, showing James at his desk, reviewing the files. It was recent. He recognized the clothes he'd worn the previous evening. That photo, more than the GPS, more than the missing document, crossed a line. It wasn't just surveillance now. It was intimidation. He forwarded the photo to Amanda using a secure channel. Her reply came quickly. "You're being watched. We need to lock everything down. No more meetings in public. Use Berners-Lee." James agreed. He made 3 immediate changes. First, he transferred his evidence archive to 2 encrypted drives and stored them in separate locations outside his home. Second, he began using a clean phone for all communications related to the investigation. And third, he prepared a sealed envelope labeled "to be opened in the event of my death" and gave it to Linda with instructions. Inside was everything: passwords, names, the contact for the attorney he had spoken with, and a summary of the evidence compiled so far. It was a grim but necessary step. Amanda, too, reported strange incidents. Her badge access was suddenly restricted from certain terminals. An unscheduled evaluation appeared on her file. She was asked to meet with HR for performance clarification, despite having no infractions in years. It was clear they were feeling the pressure from inside as well. Still, the information kept flowing. Frank confirmed that internal audit flags had been removed from at least 4 aircraft logs without explanation. Another contact sent a screenshot of a message from an executive assistant. "CEO requests all internal safety reviews be routed through his office for final approval." That was unprecedented. Normally, safety reviews went through compliance, not the CEO. This move made it impossible for concerns to bypass him. James documented everything. He wasn't just building a case anymore. He was building a shield. For Amanda, for Frank, for every person who had spoken up. The data was now distributed across multiple backups, each protected by layers of encryption. Even if they came for him, the truth wouldn't vanish with him. But the threats had changed his timeline. What he had planned to reveal slowly, methodically, would now need to surface sooner. He contacted the attorney again, more directly this time, and shared a sample of the data. She called back within hours. "This is more than negligence," she said. "Obstruction of federal safety protocols. This is suppression. You're looking at fraud, possibly." She arranged a secure meeting with a journalist known for exposing airline corruption. The idea wasn't to release the story immediately, but to prepare the ground. When the time came, it would go public in a way that could not be buried. And yet, the danger lingered. James felt it every time he left the house. Every time a car slowed near his street, he changed his routes, started leaving lights on at odd hours. At night, he slept lightly, always half listening. But fear had long since given way to resolve. He was a pilot, trained to function under pressure, to navigate storms, to land safely, no matter the odds. This was no different. The cockpit had changed, but the mission had not. He knew now that the silence around Sky Air wasn't accidental. It had been engineered brick by people more interested in image than integrity. And now that structure was cracking. They had made him a target. Now he would make them accountable. James Carter hadn't returned to the hangar district since the day he'd turned in his credentials. The smell of jet fuel and grease that once felt like home now triggered a deep unease. But when Amanda mentioned a stored file from an archived maintenance report tied to his name, he knew he had to go back. She arranged for a former clerk in records to meet them at an off-site storage facility where Sky Air's older documentation had been transferred during the digital transition. The facility was quiet, cold, and metallic. Rows of industrial shelves, stretching high with labeled boxes, many untouched for years. James recognized the filing codes, though they had long since been stripped of meaning for most of the newer staff. Amanda's contact led them through narrow corridors to a storage unit, containing technical logs and incident summaries from 5 years earlier. James rifled through folders until one caught his eye, labeled CRJ 7031 Anomaly Brake Assist. He froze. That was the flight. Jacksonville to Charlotte. The flight that nearly didn't land. He remembered it clearly now, even though the incident had been erased from the official timeline. The aircraft, CRJ 7031, had exhibited inconsistent brake pressure on final approach. The runway was dry, weather clear, but the nose dipped slightly more than expected, and he'd had to manually override the automatic braking system to stabilize the deceleration. No passengers noticed, no alarms were triggered, but something had felt off. He had filled out the post-flight anomaly log himself, detailing the pressure deviation and recommending a manual inspection. The report had disappeared from his view weeks. Later, and when he asked about it, he'd been told it was under review. Now, in the flickering light of a storage cage, he held the original hard copy. His handwriting was unmistakable. The same pressure inconsistencies were listed in detail, almost identical to those seen in the newer incidents that had grounded other aircraft in recent weeks. He flipped through the appended notes and found something even more disturbing. A follow-up maintenance log indicating the issue had been flagged as non-reproducible and marked closed. That designation, James knew, was often used when a problem couldn't be recreated during post-incident testing. But in this case, it hadn't been properly tested at all. The inspection steps listed were generic. No mention of hydraulic pressure, readings or gear stability simulations. Just a generic checklist signed with initials, T.D. Thomas DeWitt. James stared at the page, disbelief shifting into quiet fury. 5 years ago, DeWitt had been an outside consultant, contracted briefly to assess Sky Air's mechanical efficiency protocols. He hadn't been part of the company then, at least not publicly, but there it was, his initials, signing off on a rushed closure of a potentially critical safety issue. The same issue that later resurfaced in multiple aircraft, the same issue that James had tried to document before being forced out. The dots now connected further back than James had imagined. DeWitt's involvement wasn't new. He hadn't just stepped in as CEO with a plan for cost-cutting. He had been inside, embedded, shaping decisions under the guise of operational reviews. His influence had already touched maintenance policy, long before he wore the title of chief executive, and when James had tried to raise the same red flag a second time, DeWitt had simply removed him from the equation. Amanda stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. "This changes everything," she said quietly. James nodded. The narrative had shifted. It wasn't just negligence, it wasn't just silence, it was design. A system shaped by someone who understood exactly where the cracks were and chose to ignore them, then cover them with strategy and numbers. As they left the storage facility, James carried a copy of the report with him. The air outside felt different, heavier. He now understood that the pattern wasn't new. The cancellations, theme-mechanical failures, they were echoes of a problem he had already faced once and been told to forget. But the past hadn't stayed buried. It had returned, multiplied, and now hovered over every passenger Sky Air carried. Back home, James opened his archived logbook and found the original flight entry for CRJ 7031. He cross-referenced the timings, confirmed the signatures, then added the new report to his binder. The timeline now reached further back than any lawyer or journalist would expect. With it, he had the proof of pre-existing knowledge, repeated behavior, and intentional suppression. That evening, Amanda returned with a new envelope. Testimony from another pilot, this one still active, who had experienced a nearly identical braking issue on a CRJ 700 just weeks before. The report had also vanished from the internal system. But this pilot, wary of disappearing evidence, had printed and saved a copy before submission. His statement detailed not just the event, but the aftermath, being asked not to speak of the problem, reassigned without explanation, then later told. The issue had been operator error. Operator error. The phrase burned in James's ears. He had heard it used before when management didn't want to admit mechanical fault. Blame the pilot, bury the report, move on. But now, too many pilots were speaking. Too many anomalies were repeating. Too many passengers were missing connections, sitting in grounded planes while executives denied anything was wrong. James returned to the map on his wall. He drew a red line from CRJ 7031 to the newer aircraft affected, then another to the pilot, testimony, then another to the archived memo with DeWitt's initials. Each line formed the web, and at the center of that web was no longer a corporation. It was a man. This wasn't just about flight paths or mechanical parts. It was about decisions, years of them, Each made to save time, save money, save face. Each made with the knowledge that someone else, James, Amanda, any of them, might one day suffer the fallout. But that day had arrived, and the fallout wasn't theirs anymore. It belonged to the one who built the system to ignore the truth. The air in James Carter's study was thick with anticipation. The walls were now covered in documents, printouts, highlighted pages, and time-stamped memos. Every inch of space was used to map the decisions, omissions, and errors that led to Sky Air's unraveling. James had not just assembled a case, he had constructed a chronology of negligence. He wasn't working alone anymore. Amanda remained a vital source. Frank had continued to verify technical details through old colleagues, and now a young investigative journalist named Rachel Klein had joined their efforts. She wasn't just interested in the story, she wanted accountability. Rachel had spent the last 3 weeks reviewing every piece of evidence. When she arrived at James's house that morning, she carried a portable scanner, a stack of fresh notes, and our recording device. She was prepared. As she entered the room, her eyes scanned the visual timeline James had created. "This isn't just a pattern," she said, her voice sharp with focus. "This is policy. It's buried in bureaucracy and presented as operational efficiency, but it's designed to hide risk. Every time someone raised a concern, they were silenced or erased. You were just the most experienced one." James didn't need the validation, but hearing it spoken aloud, clearly and without hesitation, gave him a sense of finality. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't overreaction. It had always been real. Rachel wanted to move fast. She believed the story needed to be published, not just for legal accountability, but to protect passengers. The data pointed to continuing risk. Planes still flying with incomplete inspections. Maintenance crews pressured into closing tickets early. Pilots hesitant to report anomalies for fear of being labeled difficult. They prepared the package meticulously. Every document was scanned, categorized, and cross-referenced. Rachel verified each source, made follow-up calls to the silent witnesses James and Amanda had brought forward, and ensured that no claim was left unsupported. The article wasn't written like an exposé. It was written like an indictment, methodical, factual, devastating. When the piece went live, 5,000 words under the headline "Broken Wings: How Sky Air Sacrificed Safety for Profit," the reaction was immediate. Within hours, it spread across major networks. Morning news anchors read from it on live television. Industry analysts issued statements. Airline forums lit up with discussion. Employees still within Sky Air started leaking their own files anonymously, many confirming the central claims. Sky Air's official response came swiftly and predictably. A press release appeared within 12 hours, dismissing the allegations as sensationalized, calling the data incomplete and misinterpreted, and affirming that all aircraft operate within the bounds of federal safety regulations. They accused Rachel of journalistic bias. They did not mention James by name, but James was not hiding. At Rachel's request, he appeared in a follow-up segment 2 days later, sitting in front of a neutral backdrop, wearing a simple shirt and speaking with the same calm authority he once carried in the cockpit. James explained what had happened. He detailed his report on the CRJ 7031, his dismissal, the missing maintenance data, and the threats he received. He spoke without drama, without exaggeration, just facts. And when asked why he had risked everything to bring the truth forward, he answered simply, "Because someone had to. Because every flight should land safely." The impact of the interview was profound. Within hours, passenger groups began organizing online. Travel advocacy organizations called for a federal audit. The Department of Transportation released a statement confirming an internal review into Sky Air's compliance records. Several news outlets picked up the story and expanded on it. The momentum was no longer in James's hands. It was in motion, and it wasn't stopping. Inside Sky Air, panic set in. Amanda reported an emergency meeting called at headquarters. Internal communications leaked. Executives demanded loyalty. Supervisors were told to double down on narrative control. But cracks formed. A senior member of the compliance team resigned. A pilot filed a formal complaint. A former dispatcher came forward with copies of internal memos showing deliberate misrouting to avoid FAA inspections. James stayed in contact with the attorney, who now believed the case warranted civil and possibly criminal litigation. She began, preparing documents ready to present the case formally. A class action was being considered, and James would be called to testify. The last to react was Thomas DeWitt. His name had been mentioned in Rachel's article but not emphasized. That changed when more documents surfaced: his override orders, his initials on dismissed safety reviews, his directives to internal auditors to reroute findings through his office. His silence after the article's release grew more damning with each day. Finally, a public relations spokesperson announced that DeWitt would issue a statement at the end of the week. But James didn't care about his words anymore. Statements meant nothing. The system had spoken in its failures, and the record now stood. In awe, the days following the release, Sky Air's flight operations grew erratic. Delays increased, cancellations climbed. Passengers refused to board aircraft marked in the reports. News helicopters hovered over terminals. The company had spent years cultivating the image of punctuality and reliability. That image now crumbled under the weight of truth, and yet James did not feel triumphant. What he had done wasn't about victory. It was about obligation. He had looked into the void of silence and chosen to answer it. And now, even as the company pushed back, even as legal threats loomed, he knew they had already lost the one thing they could never recover: trust. The courtroom was a world away from cockpits, checklists, and flight paths, yet James Carter found himself navigating it with the same focus he had once reserved for turbulent skies. The proceedings had moved fast, faster than anyone anticipated. Once Rachel Klein's article gained national traction and federal regulators confirmed they had opened an inquiry into Sky Air's practices, a group of passengers who had suffered repeated cancellations and mid-flight delays filed a class action lawsuit. The plaintiffs argued not merely inconvenience, but a systematic pattern of corporate negligence that had put lives at risk. The court agreed to hear it. James was called as a key witness. He sat in a waiting area outside the chamber, the formal statement he had prepared resting loosely in his hands. He wasn't nervous, not exactly, but the weight of the moment pressed on him. Years of service, a career dismantled without explanation, and months of sleepless nights piecing together a shattered puzzle. All of it had led here. Now, in a courtroom surrounded by lawyers, reporters, and families he had never met, he would explain what had been hidden insolence for far too long. When he took the stand, the room quieted. The attorney representing the plaintiffs, a measured and precise woman named Helen Armitage, walked James through his background: years of service, flight experience, certifications, and his unblemished safety record. She made it clear this was a man who had not only followed the rules, but had helped shape them for others. Then came the questions that mattered. Captain Carter, did you ever report mechanical concerns about the CRJ fleet prior to your dismissal? Yes, James replied. I submitted a formal technical memo detailing repeated hydraulic inconsistencies on specific aircraft. Did you receive a response to this memo? No written response. Informally, I was told the matter would be monitored, but I never received confirmation that inspections were performed as recommended. Helen handed the judge a copy of the memo. Is this the document you submitted? James confirmed it. The judge reviewed the paper, nodding slowly. Helen continued. Were you made aware of any consequences following the report? Yes. Approximately 3 months later, I was terminated without cause under the pretext of restructuring. My position was eliminated, and a less experienced pilot was brought in immediately. She paused. Do you believe your termination was related to your report? I do, James said. There was no prior warning, no performance review indicating dissatisfaction. I believe the report was viewed as a threat. The defense, representing Sky Air, attempted to discredit him. They questioned the validity of their report, the supposed timing, and whether his interpretation of the data could be seen as subjective. But James remained composed. When they tried to suggest that the braking anomalies might have been minor, he countered with data. When they claimed the report had never reached upper management, James presented the version initialed by Thomas DeWitt during his consultancy period. It was undeniable. Then the bombshell dropped. A court-ordered discovery request forced Sky Air to release a set of internal communications previously withheld. Among the documents was an email thread dated 6 weeks before James's termination. The sender, Thomas DeWitt. The subject line, Carter Memo. The content, a directive to remove certain maintenance items from public logs and reallocate crew assignments to minimize further reports from legacy personnel. The courtroom murmured. The judge called for silence. That email became the turning point. Suddenly, everything James and his allies had uncovered gained judicial weight. It was no longer circumstantial. It was a record of intent. More internal documents surfaced. Logs where safety warnings had been downgraded, towed advisory notes without justification, requests from maintenance staff that were overruled by executives, citing priority continuity, and financial projections forecasting increased efficiency metrics if inspections were reduced across the fleet. One spreadsheet, dated just before DeWitt's appointment as CEO, revealed projected savings based on reduced mechanical downtime per aircraft. These projections aligned almost perfectly with the schedule alterations James had documented. The trial extended over several weeks, drawing national attention. Former employees came forward, some under subpoena, others willingly. One former scheduler revealed she had been asked to manipulate timestamps. A mechanic testified that he was instructed not to report a gear locking malfunction because the plane was needed for a high-occupancy route. Their dispatch supervisor broke down on the stand as he described being pressured to reroute aircraft known to be awaiting parts. And then came the final witness, Amanda. She spoke clearly, her voice unwavering. She confirmed the sequence of events. The missing reports, the restricted access, and the fear many employees felt after James's dismissal. Her words reinforced every claim, every piece of evidence. She also confirmed the surveillance James had endured, showing the court the photo of him taken through his study window and referencing the GPS tracker found in his car. By the time closing, arguments were made. The case had transformed from a contractual dispute into an ethics reckoning. Sky Air's legal team looked defeated, their strategy reduced to damage control. When the jury returned its verdict, there was no suspense. Liability, confirmed. Damages, awarded. Compensation, approved for all plaintiffs. And while James hadn't filed as a plaintiff, the judge acknowledged his role in exposing the danger and signed off on a formal commendation for whistleblower integrity. But what truly mattered wasn't the paper. It was the court's final recommendation to federal aviation regulators, an immediate audit of Sky Air's operations and the criminal investigation of executive negligence. Thomas DeWitt was placed on indefinite leave pending further inquiry. As James left the courthouse, a light drizzle fell on the steps. Amanda stood beside him, silent, her coat pulled tight. Rachel met them near the edge of the street with her notebook closed for once. "You did it," she said. James didn't answer. He looked up at the grey sky, where distant contrails carved pale scars across the clouds. He wasn't flying anymore, but something had landed. And this time it wouldn't be hidden. The court decision changed everything. For the public, it marked the exposure of a company once seen as a symbol of regional reliability. For employees, it meant the possibility of healing, of returning to a system where integrity outweighed performance quotas. But for James Carter, it meant something different. The fight had been won but not completed. He had brought light into the darkness, yes, but now came the part he had never planned for, rebuilding what had been broken. Sky Air's board of directors moved quickly. With DeWitt removed, the interim leadership issued a statement accepting responsibility for the company's past failures and pledging complete cooperation with ongoing investigations. Their words were met with skepticism, but their next actions spoke louder. The board dissolved the executive team involved in the scandal, suspended operations on routes serviced by aircraft under review, and publicly invited a coalition of independent aviation experts to assist in rebuilding their safety infrastructure. James was not among those invited. Not at first. He had returned to a quieter life, or tried to. The files were boxed, the timeline maps removed from the walls, the encrypted drives stored away. But there was no return to what once was. His name had become synonymous with the company's downfall, and reporters still knocked on his door weeks after the verdict. He declined interviews, avoided public statements, and spent his days walking in the nearby park with Linda or sitting in the yard reading manuals and technical bulletins, not because he needed to, but because it was all he had ever known. One afternoon, an envelope arrived with the Skyair insignia on the corner. Inside was a formal letter, signed by the new acting CEO, acknowledging James's role in exposing the crisis and requesting a meeting to discuss a potential advisory position. Not as a reinstated pilot, but as a consultant for the safety board they were forming, a group tasked with rebuilding operational integrity from the inside out. James stared at the letter for a long time. He didn't know whether to laugh or tear it apart. After everything, the silence, the dismissal, the surveillance, they wanted his help to clean up Themis. Linda found him outside that evening, the letter resting beside him on the armrest of the old wooden chair. "You're going to say no," she said, not as a question, but a statement. He nodded slowly. "I should." She waited. "But I can't." He said the words quietly, almost reluctantly. She didn't protest. The meeting was held at a temporary Skyair facility in Raleigh, far from the chaos of headquarters. The new leadership was cautious, respectful, and clear. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They asked for truth. They presented James with outlines of new protocols, proposed changes to maintenance procedures, and ideas for increasing transparency between crew and command. James listened, asked questions. Then, for the first time in months, he stood before a whiteboard and began rewriting checklists, not for flight crews, but for systems of accountability. His suggestions were blunt, real-time inspection reports that could not be edited retroactively, a whistleblower portal managed by a third-party oversight group, reinstating mandatory review boards for all in-flight anomalies, no exceptions. They agreed to all of it. When Amanda heard he had accepted the role of consultant, she laughed. "They don't know what they've signed up for," she said. He smiled. "Neither do I." His presence at the company wasn't ceremonial. He returned weekly, reviewing every policy proposal and rejecting any plan that leaned on vague language or efficiency over clarity. He demanded that every plane grounded for inspection have its service history revalidated by at least 2 independent technicians. He pushed for internal training that prioritized decision-making under pressure, not just technical skill, but ethical reasoning. He never wore the uniform again. That chapter was closed. But he stood in classrooms before new hires, telling them not how to land a plane, but how to speak up when something didn't feel right. He didn't use notes. He didn't talk about DeWitt or lawsuits or the past directly. He just told them that silence in aviation was never neutral, that every second between doubt and decision was a chance to either prevent disaster or invite. His sessions became known internally as the line briefing. In every talk, he said one line that became a kind of mantra among the new pilots. The line between safe and sorry is only invisible if you pretend not to see it. Not everyone welcomed him. Some still viewed him as the man who had turned on his own company. But those voices faded with time, especially as passengers returned, cancellation rates dropped, and regulatory agencies lifted their oversight restrictions one by one. Months passed. The headlines faded. Skyair issued new annual reports showing reduced incident rates, improved crew retention, and the reinstatement of routes once deemed compromised. The industry took note. Other airlines began requesting consultation from the team James had helped form. Integrity, once dismissed as inefficient, had become their selling point. James stayed on, not as a permanent staff member, but as a retained advisor. He refused pay beyond a basic retainer, donating his compensation to a fund for aviation students needing financial support. When asked why, he only said, "Because someone gave me a chance once. Someone should again." At home, life returned to something quieter. Linda watched him from the porch in the evenings, knowing he hadn't come all the way back to the man she married, but knowing he had survived something that could have destroyed anyone. He no longer dreamed of flying. That part of him had been sealed away, like a chapter in a logbook no longer in use, but he still looked up every time a plane crossed the sky. Not with longing, with vigilance and hope. The conference room was modest, tucked within the newer wing of Sky Air's restructured training facility just outside Charlotte. Chairs were arranged in rows, each one filled by a fresh uniform, young faces, bright eyes, voices still unshaped by years of protocol and fatigue. These were cadets, new recruits, the future of an airline that had narrowly avoided complete collapse, and at the front of the room stood James Carter, not in uniform, not behind a cockpit door, but standing with his hands steady and his eyes calm. He didn't use a screen. No slides, no flashy videos, just a voice that had once announced landings and turbulence updates over an intercom now offering something else. Truth. He began not with his career, but with silence. There's a kind of quiet you'll learn to listen for, he said. Not the kind you hear in a cockpit when the engines settle, but the kind that comes when something isn't being said, when systems don't report the full story, when decisions are made behind closed doors and passed down to you without context. The room was still. You'll be told to trust the checklist, trust the chain of command, trust the process, and most of the time you should, but never at the cost of asking questions. He told them about one flight, Jacksonville to Charlotte, a hydraulic anomaly, no emergency, no damage. But something had felt wrong. He reported it, followed procedure, expected action. Nothing came. And that silence, he said, was the loudest warning of my career. He walked them through the aftermath, not as a tale of personal loss, but as a reminder that decisions made far from the cockpit could shape what happened in it. That the systems meant to protect were only as strong as the people willing to speak. When they faltered, "You will be the last line of defense," he said, "not the lawyers, not the managers, you." They listened, not out of obligation, but because they could see the weight in his eyes, the weight of someone who had lived through what most only trained for in simulations. Someone who had been on the other side of silence and returned not bitter but certain. When he finished, they applauded. Not loudly, not like a show. It was a recognition of truth, of cost, of courage. Outside, the air was sharp and clear. Spring was shifting toward summer. Planes lifted from runways in clean arcs, climbing toward distant destinations. Sky Air had resumed its full schedule, now operating with layers of oversight, internal and external. Each flight was logged and cross-checked, with transparency built into the system by design, not by accident. James stayed at the facility a while longer, speaking with instructors, reviewing revisions to training modules. He made suggestions, not demands, a note here, a line there. Subtle shifts in how new pilots were taught to approach authority, to trust their instincts, to understand that questioning procedure wasn't rebellion, but responsibility. Linda met him that evening at the diner they used to frequent in the early years of his career. Ith had the same red booths, the same dull hum of conversations blending into the clink of cutlery. They ate quietly, not because there was nothing to say, but because words weren't always needed. On the way home, James looked out the window. In the distance, a plane crossed beneath the setting sun, its silhouette clean against the horizon. He thought about the man he had been, the one who once thought longevity alone would protect him, the one who had believed that following the rules was enough. He thought about the man who had left Sky Air with nothing but a folded jacket in his arms and 100 questions unspoken. Now he had answers, and more importantly, so did everyone else. He returned home and placed a final document into the binder he kept locked in his study. The binder was thick now, worn at the edges, its cover faded. Inside it was everything: the memos, the logs, the statements, the article, the verdict, the truth. But also, inside it, tucked behind the last page, was a letter. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. It was for the next person who might find themselves sitting in silence, unsure of what they were hearing. It read, "When the system goes quiet, listen harder. And when no one answers, be the one who does." James closed the binder, locked the drawer, and stepped outside. Above him, the sky was clear. And for the first time in years, he didn't look up with regret. He looked up and felt peace. The story had found its landing, and this time, it was safe.